Let's talk about Wordsworth. What is Wordsworth's secret? How great was he among the Romantics, and what do you think the sort of essence of his vision was?
I think he was the greatest of all the Romantic poets, and one of the very greatest English poets altogether. If by no other measure than the measure that English poetry after him is never the same again. And I think that if I had to single out the things that Wordsworth brought to English poetry, I suppose I'd say two things. One is he writes about individual human experience in a very startlingly new way. Particularly childhood experience, but all adult experience, and shows in a way that anticipates people like Virginia Woolf or Joyce, the ways in which the things that you go through shape the person that you become. This is to us a completely obvious thought.
But it wasn't obvious then.
Well, no one else thinks to write their biography in the way that Wordsworth writes the Prelude, in which the adult that you are is seen to be the fruit, the result of the childhood that you had, and he continues to write poems of wonderful power about experiences that are completely formative, but at the same time very, very difficult to rationalize or to categorize. So I think there's something very powerful in Wordsworth about the elusiveness, but at the same time the momentousness of ordinary experiences. So that's one thing I'd say. And the second thing, which in a way follows on from that, is that there is implicitly something egalitarian about his poetry, which is to say that the kinds of experiences that I'm describing are those that are common to everyone. Hazlitt said he had a levelling muse, which was ambiguous praise.
But Wordsworth had a levelling.
Yes, that's right, exactly. So even though by the time he writes most of the poems that we know him for, he's been through his left-wing phase and come out the other side, there is in a sense a kind of figurative or metaphorical kind of democratic spirit that informs a lot of his verse. He says in one of his prose works that, one of his letters, I should say, he says in one of his letters that he writes partly to show that men who do not wear fine clothes can feel deeply. And that kind of emphasis to his work seems to me a very characteristically modern one, picked up in later years by Robert Frost and Thomas Hardy and Edward Thomas and really Philip Larkin, and really the main line of English poetry ever since.
I've asked you one very obvious question, so why don't we look at the poem, and why don't we look at perhaps the most obvious poem, very famous poem, not just of Wordsworth, one of the most famous poems in the language, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which I think is the right name for it, not
That's right.
Daffodils as it's often called.
It is often called Daffodils, you're right.
Could you first of all read it for us,
Yeah.
Seamus?
I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of dancing daffodils. Along the lake, beneath the trees, 10,000 dancing in the breeze. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a laughing company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils.
I suppose at first reading, if you come to this, you think it's very nice, it's very cheerful, but is it really very deep? Does it a good poem perhaps about daffodils, but what does it really tell us, this poem?
Well, I think it's like a lot of Wordsworth in that a superficial simplicity actually disguises rather more complicated and richer things that are going on underneath. And I think the point you made at the very beginning there, John, about it often being called daffodils is important, because that's a serious misnomer. The poem is obviously prompted by an encounter with daffodils, but that's not where the poem ends up. And if you had to say, as it were, on the back of a postcard, exactly what experience the poem is principally about, then it's actually a poem about sitting on your sofa. It's a poem about recollecting
About memory.
It is, exactly, about recollecting this chance encounter with daffodils, as it were, a splendid but entirely normal kind of scene, a kind of a spectacle. And then in the third verse, we get the turn, which makes the poem exactly what it is. It's a poem about lying in vacant or in pensive mood, when the daffodils involuntarily come back to you. So it's a poem of involuntary memory, the kind of thing that Proust will become interested in many, many years later. And you could almost say that the word upon which the whole poem turns, very far from being the word daffodils, the word upon which the whole poem turns is the word then in the second to last line, because it's on your couch, then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils in the way that it didn't dance with the daffodils the first time. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. So the poem has a kind of riddling quality to it, in that it doesn't turn out to be about the experience that you think it's going to be about. And it's a great example of the way that Wordsworth finds sorts of complexity to do with memory and to do with kind of the involuntary recollection of things that belies a kind of surface simplicity.
And going back to what you were saying about the child being father of the man and the importance of memory in shaping us.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
But is it odd in a way, this, because it still does have quite an upbeat feel to it, doesn't it? And yet in many ways Wordsworth, I mean, he lost 2 sons, didn't he? He wasn't really that cheerful through a lot of his poetry isn't that cheerful. Is this poem unusual, or?
No, I don't think it's unusual. It's true that that Wordsworth has a lot of unhappiness in his life, and I think that it's also true that a lot of unhappiness, or what he will often call despondency, gets into the poems. But it's a very important part of Wordsworth's whole moral consciousness that despondency needs to be addressed in some way. That makes him sound rather kind of Victorian and ghastly, but that's not how the best Wordsworth poems come across. He has a tremendous, he places a tremendous weight, as it were, upon the emotional and the philosophical importance of happiness, or what he calls in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, the grand elementary principle of pleasure. These are important things, and they describe a very modern and in some ways very secular kind of modern view towards what makes a good life and what makes a sustainable life. And it's important here, it seems to me, that the daffodils that might to us seem a quintessentially poetic plant are largely that because of this poem. In Wordsworth's, in the consciousness of Wordsworth's contemporaries, daffodils are very mean and insignificant kind of flora, and people at the time complained about the way that he was piling upon plants of such insignificance, such a lot of emotional weight. It's what his friend Coleridge calls mental bombast, where the emotions or the reflections seem too big for the object in the world that has apparently prompted them. But that's Wordsworth's point. Wordsworth's point is that tremendous emotional and indeed philosophical consequences can hinge on encounters with extremely
seemingly very ordinary
or
things,
even banal things. Yeah.
And that I suppose you're saying is the heart of Wordsworth. It's that the ordinariness of so much that he writes about, and yet he transfigures it.
I think that's right. And as I say, as a frame of mind, it goes through very influentially into lots and lots of modern writers. So as a great authority once said about James Joyce, the achievement of Joyce was to reveal the ordinary as something that was extraordinary. And I think that's what Wordsworth does. Joyce is a great admirer of Wordsworth, and I think that's one of the things that he learns from him.
And in your view, he does that. I mean, I assume some of this, what you're saying, is true of other romantic poets like Coleridge, with whom he fell out, and Keats. But of course, Wordsworth wrote much longer than they did and lived much longer. And you think he just did that all better? Is that putting it too crudely?
Yes, I think the Romantics are each doing different sorts of things, so it's a mistake, I think, in a way, to group them too tightly and to think that they're all pursuing the same agenda. But they do share, or many of them share with Wordsworth this interest in again, to use a Joycean word, the power of the ordinary world to have a kind of epiphanic or the quality of an epiphany. what Coleridge calls removing the veil of familiarity from our ordinary lives, things that we might have walked past 10,000 times before and never noticed. And I think that, yes, Wordsworth does do that very, very, very powerfully. Of course, I mean, there's stretches of later Wordsworth which perhaps don't move us as much as early Wordsworth. But I mean, even in later Wordsworth, you'll find in Strange Corners some of this same ability to evoke the potential kind of numinousness of the ordinary very powerfully.